Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity gets comfortable and ancient mysteries take the scenic path towards sleep. Tonight, we'll drift into one of the oldest and most debated stories in all of human thought. A story that begins under Mesopotamian skies and travels across millennia, following a name that once echoed among many gods before standing alone, Yahweh. The name that would one day fill scriptures, shape nations, and define what much of the world now calls God. But before it was sacred, before it was written, it may have been whispered on desert winds, spoken in a dozen dialects, tied to mountains, storms, and ancient memory. If you find this quiet exploration soothing, if ancient history helps you unwind or curiosity helps you rest, I'd be grateful if you left a like or subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm reach others who might find peace in forgotten stories too. As you settle in, maybe take a slow breath and notice the stillness around you. Somewhere, not far from this moment, the first people to utter the name we're about to follow might have been staring up at the same stars, wondering who or what watched from above. And now, across thousands of years, we trace that thought again, from clay tablets to temple walls, from thunder to prayer, from myth to meaning. Because before Yahweh was the God of the Bible, before his name filled songs and laws and hopes, he may have walked among a crowd of other gods, part of a cosmic family older than any scripture. Long before the lands of Israel and Judah knew the word monotheism, the ancient Near East was filled with divine noise. Every city had its protector, every region its patron, every river and mountain its spirit. To the east, the Sumerians and Akkadians honoured the Anunnaki, those great gods who governed the heavens and earth. To the west, the Canaanites told stories of El, Baal and Asherah, gods of wind, fertility and creation. Between them, the Egyptians raised monuments to Ra and Osiris, and the Hittites sang of storm lords whose tempests could break empires. It was a crowded sky, busy with divine personalities, and somewhere within it a small wandering people began to form their own vision of the divine. Yahweh's earliest traces lie hidden in fragments, an inscription carved on stone in a desert shrine, a passing reference in Egyptian records, a curious alignment of names on clay tablets. In those early centuries, around the second millennium before our era, worship was not exclusive. The divine world was a hierarchy, and gods were regional powers. A people might pray to one deity without denying the existence of others. Each was bound to a place, a power, a purpose. Yet among these many, one name began to travel differently. There are records of a group the Egyptians called the Shasu of Yu, desert dwellers in the land stretching between Edom and Midian. They were nomads, herders and traders, living where few cities could survive. Their god, or perhaps their tribal protector, was called Yu. Some scholars believe this was an early form of Yahweh, a mountain or storm deity whose domain lay in the dry highlands south of Canaan. His name may have meant he who brings into being, or he causes to exist, a description of creative force rather than a personal figure. Whatever its exact meaning, it carried the rhythm of wind over stone, a god of movement, of weather, of the unpredictable power of life in harsh lands. Those early worshippers would not have thought of Yahweh as unique. To them he was one among many powers that governed the world. But something about this deity, his ferocity, his independence, or perhaps the loyalty of his people, began to set him apart. The Canaanite pantheon, so well ordered and established, made room for countless divine personalities, yet Yahweh's image began to sharpen outside of their structure. He was not merely another name for El, though later texts would intertwine them, nor was he fully Baal, though both shared the thunder and the storm. Yahweh seemed to belong to no city, no temple, no single land. He was a god of those who moved, of tents rather than walls, of covenants rather than empires. In the soft silence between civilizations, his story began to travel north. By the time small tribes began to settle the highlands of Canaan, this god of the wilderness came with them. His worship was simple, portable, and bound not to idols but to words. The desert had taught its lessons. Stone statues could not feed you. Rituals could not summon rain. What mattered was relationship, a voice that spoke from fire, a promise carried in belief. This transition from storm to covenant, from elemental power to personal guide, may have been the earliest turning point. When those early highland settlers began to call themselves Israelites, their worship of Yahweh was not yet the exclusive monotheism we recognize. It was a devotion among others, but with an intensity that slowly grew. Over generations, as kingdoms rose and fell, as alliances with neighbouring peoples came and went, Yahweh became more than a local deity. He became a symbol of identity, a rallying centre for tribes bound by shared ancestry and shared struggle. And through it all, the echoes of older myths lingered. In Mesopotamian stories, Enlil ruled the air and commanded the floods. In Canaan, El was the father of gods, and Baal wielded the lightning. Yahweh inherited their language of power. He spoke through storms, descended in fire, parted waters. His anger could shake mountains. His favour could bring fertility to the earth. To the ancient mind, such traits were the marks of legitimacy. Only the mightiest gods could master weather, creation, and destiny. In this sense, Yahweh's story mirrors the rise of others before him, but his followers began to interpret those powers differently. Where older cultures saw divine families quarrelling and scheming, Yahweh's early prophets began to describe a singular will. Not a cosmic court, not a council of competing gods, but one source, one intention behind creation and morality alike. It was a subtle shift at first, a narrowing of divine focus. Yet this narrowing would change everything. For the first time, one god began to eclipse the rest, not by denying them outright, but by absorbing their roles, their symbols, their authority. The god of storms became the creator of the world. The protector of nomads became the judge of nations. The voice in the wilderness became the voice of the universe. As centuries passed, the stories grew in complexity. The Israelites, caught between empires, saw in Yahweh not just a deity of nature but of justice, memory, and endurance. Every triumph was his gift, every disaster a lesson. In exile, they carried his name as both burden and comfort, the one thing that could not be taken from them. Through defeat, captivity, and return, Yahweh transformed again, not just the God of a people, but the God of history itself, and somewhere in the layers of clay, in the fragments of inscriptions, in the echoes of Sumerian hymns and Babylonian prayers, one can still trace the faint roots that tie him back to those earliest gods, the Anunnaki, the celestial assembly that once governed the fates of men. To some scholars, Yahweh's distant ancestry may stretch all the way back to Enlil, the Lord of Wind, or to El, the High Father whose name appears beside his in early texts. Yet whatever his beginnings, Yahweh's story became uniquely human, a reflection of the longing for order in a world of chaos, for permanence in a world of change. The evolution from many gods to one was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual awakening, born of generations interpreting the same sky through new eyes. The people changed, their languages changed, their borders and enemies changed, but the idea of Yahweh endured and adapted, always reshaped to fit the age that needed him. What began as a tribal storm god became the moral compass of a civilization. What began as one name among hundreds became the name above all others. And as we move deeper into the story, we'll find how this transformation unfolded, how ancient myths, political ambitions, and human longing wove together into the image of a single divine presence. Somewhere between the deserts of Midian and the writings of prophets, between temples and exile, between myth and memory, the figure of Yahweh emerged not only as a god, but as an idea that would outlive its own origins. The journey from Anunnaki to the God of the Bible is one of continuity and change, of forgotten echoes carried through faith. It is the story of how humanity turned the sky into a mirror and found its reflection looking back. And as the dust of ancient cities settles in the quiet of the night, we follow that reflection now toward the crowded heavens where Yahweh's earliest companions still whisper in the background of history. In the earliest ages of recorded thought, the world seemed alive with divine presence. The rivers spoke, the hills listened, the stars moved with intention. To live in that world was to walk through a landscape thick with meaning, where every shadow might conceal a spirit, every gust of wind might carry the voice of a god. There was no sharp line dividing the human and the divine. The two existed in a constant exchange, woven together by ritual, by fear, by gratitude. It was in this wide and echoing realm that the idea of Yahweh first began to take shape, not as an isolated revelation, but as part of a chorus of sacred voices that filled the ancient Near Eastern sky. Civilization itself began in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, where the first cities rose along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There, the Sumerians watched the heavens and believed that their fates were bound to the moods of the gods above. The Anunnaki ruled their world, a council of divine beings who governed every aspect of existence: sky, earth, water, and the underworld. They were not distant abstractions, but personalities with tempers and desires, much like the humans who served them. The people built temples that reached upward like mountains, ziggurats layered toward the clouds, in hopes that the divine might look down favourably. Each city had its patron deity. In Uruk, it was Inanna, the radiant queen of heaven. In Eridu, it was Enki, lord of wisdom and the subterranean waters. In Nippur, Enlil reigned as the father of gods, the master of air and authority. Their stories explained creation, justified kingship, and described the delicate balance between order and chaos. When the rivers flooded or the crops failed, it was because the gods had quarrelled or turned away. When the harvest was good, it was a sign of their favour. Life was negotiation, sacrifice for stability, ritual for protection. As centuries passed, empires rose and fell across these plains. The Akkadians, inheriting much of Sumer's belief, gave the gods new names and new layers of grandeur. The Babylonians refined them further, placing Marduk at the centre, a conqueror among divinities who subdued chaos itself to bring creation into order. The Assyrians would later carry those same gods into war, making divinity a companion of conquest. Through it all, the pantheon expanded and contracted, each new kingdom rearranging heaven's hierarchy. Beyond Mesopotamia, the Canaanites built their own vision of the divine. They spoke of El, the High Father, serene and distant, seated on a cosmic mountain from which the waters of life flowed. Around him gathered his divine family, the council of the gods, sons and daughters who ruled the elements and the earth. Among them was Baal, the Stormbringer, fierce and unpredictable, who fought the sea god Yam and the death god Mot in endless cycles of struggle and renewal. Their myths carried echoes of the older Mesopotamian stories, but bore their own flavour. Closer to the land, tied to the seasons, bound to the rhythm of rain and drought. The Egyptian world, too, had its celestial families, Ra sailing across the sky in his solar bark, Osiris reigning in the realm of the dead, Isis and Horus continuing the eternal drama of protection and resurrection. The Hittites to the north told of the storm god Tahun, the great bull who ruled from the clouds. To the east, the Persians began to contemplate Ahura Mazda, a god of light and truth who stood in moral opposition to darkness. Each culture crafted its own version of order against chaos, life against decay, good against destruction. Across all these lands, the gods were many, yet their roles and attributes overlapped. The storm god of one culture could be recognized in the thunder god of another. The creator of one people might resemble the High Father of the next. The names changed, the languages shifted, but the divine pattern remained. It was a network of mirrors, each reflecting the others with slight distortions, each passing on fragments of a shared ancient heritage. Within that intricate web of belief, Yahweh's name would later emerge. He was not yet alone, not yet the singular creator of heaven and earth. He was a regional figure, perhaps born from the storm and the mountain, shaped by the same mythic currents that had carried Enlil, Baal and El before him. The earliest Israelites lived among peoples who believed in this divine council. They shared borders, markets, marriages, and inevitably stories. It was impossible to live in Canaan without breathing its religion. Even those who would later call Yahweh their only God were raised in a world where the sky was filled with others. Archaeology reveals the complexity of that spiritual environment. Clay figurines of goddesses, amulets invoking multiple divine names, inscriptions blending Yahweh with other deities, all testify to a time when religious boundaries were fluid. Inscriptions from Kuntilet Ajrud, a remote site in the Sinai, mention Yahweh and his Asherah, suggesting that even Yahweh once had a divine consort, a remnant of the older, more pluralistic vision of heaven. The worship of many gods was not rebellion, but reality. Exclusive devotion to one was still a rare and radical idea. The Canaanite pantheon offered a model of divine administration that mirrored human society. At its head was El, ancient and wise. Beneath him sat the council of the gods, the sons of El, who managed various domains: weather, fertility, war, death. The similarities between these divine councils and the early Hebrew descriptions of Yahweh's assembly are striking. Passages in the oldest Hebrew poetry still hint at a time when Yahweh presided among other divine beings, issuing commands and receiving praise. Over time, those beings would be redefined as angels, messengers rather than equals. But the echoes of an older theology remained. In this crowded divine landscape, devotion was transactional. People did not serve gods out of abstract faith, but out of necessity. Each deity offered something tangible: rain for the crops, protection from disease, success in battle. Temples were centers of both worship and economy, maintaining the rhythm of community life. Festivals aligned with planting and harvest, with the turning of the moon, with the expectation that human reverence kept the world in balance. The divine order mirrored the natural one, and every prayer was a plea to keep the cycle unbroken. When the early Israelites emerged as a distinct people, they inherited this entire structure of thought. Their ancestors had lived under Egyptian rule, traded with Canaanite cities, and wandered the deserts near Midian and Edom. They had absorbed the languages, symbols, and stories of all these neighbours. To them, Yahweh was not born in isolation, but drawn from the same cosmic vocabulary. He thundered like Baal, commanded like El, and yet possessed an intimacy that set him apart. He did not merely dwell above the world, but walked with his people, argued with them, guided them through hardship. It was this closeness that may have been Yahweh's first distinction. Where the great gods of Mesopotamia and Egypt were often remote, cosmic administrators who seldom intervened directly, Yahweh appeared as a god of relationship. His earliest followers believed they could call to him and be heard, that he responded not only to kings, but to shepherds and wanderers. This personal nature gave him a different tone, a god who travelled with his people, shared their tents, joined their struggles. In an age of monumental temples and distant deities, such intimacy was extraordinary. Still, Yahweh was one voice among many. The Israelites of the early Iron Age lived surrounded by competing cults. In the valleys and on the high places, shrines to Baal and Asherah flourished. Local deities promised rain, health, and prosperity. It would take centuries before the prophets of Israel began to challenge this diversity, insisting that Yahweh alone held power. But before that transformation, before the declarations of monotheism, there was a long period of overlap, of coexistence, of shared symbols and blended stories. When we look at the hymns and psalms that survive from Israel's earliest traditions, we hear traces of that shared past. Yahweh rides the clouds as Baal once did. He commands the storm, shakes the earth and defeats the sea, just as Marduk had conquered Tiamat. These images were not copied but inherited. drawn from the common pool of mythic language that the entire region shared. Over time, as Yahweh's worshippers sought to define him against the others, they reinterpreted those images, turning them from myth into theology, from nature to morality. The storm became not a natural event, but a symbol of judgment. The sea was no longer a monster to be slain, but a force to be controlled by divine will. Through this process, the world began to change. The Divine Council, once a chorus of equals, became a hierarchy with one voice rising above all others. The old gods faded, redefined as servants or illusions. The stories that had once described many powers acting in conflict were rewritten as the will of one God shaping all things. But before that consolidation, the sky was filled with conversation. Each culture spoke its own dialect of divinity, and the people who would later write the Bible were fluent in that language. To understand Yahweh's rise is to listen to those ancient whispers. It is to stand on the threshold of monotheism and hear the murmuring of a world still full of gods. It is to recognize that before the idea of one divine truth took hold, humanity lived in a universe of plural possibilities, where belief was less a boundary and more a bridge between people and the unknown. The transformation from that world to the one we know now did not happen in a single generation. It unfolded slowly, across borders and centuries, carried by traders, scribes, and storytellers. The myths of Sumer and Akkad blended with those of Canaan and Egypt, and from their mingling new theologies were born. In the midst of that exchange, Yahweh's name began to resonate differently. What had once been a regional god's title began to carry universal weight. The road from many gods to one was not only theological but emotional. It reflected the human desire for coherence in a world of chaos. In a landscape of constant invasion, drought and exile, the idea of one steadfast deity offered stability. The pantheons of the past, with their quarrels and rivalries, mirrored the unpredictability of nature. But a single God, faithful and just, could promise order, justice, and hope. Yahweh became the answer to that longing, the condensation of all divine power into one compassionate yet commanding presence. Yet even as monotheism began to take shape, the echoes of the old pantheon remained. They lingered in language, in ritual, in the structure of stories. The prophets who would one day speak of Yahweh's exclusivity were still descendants of a world that had known divine multiplicity. Their call to worship one God was radical, precisely because it challenged the memory of countless others. When we picture that ancient sky, filled with divine movement, it's not difficult to see how such a transformation could begin. The heavens were vast, the earth uncertain, and humanity, fragile and searching, sought patterns in the storm. In that search, one name began to shine brighter than the rest, gathering around itself the qualities once shared among many. The others faded, absorbed, remembered only in fragments and footnotes. But Yahweh endured, evolving from one among the multitude to the embodiment of the divine itself. The world of many gods gave birth to the idea of one. The chaos of myth gave rise to the calm of faith. And somewhere in that long passage between thunder and silence, the crowded heavens began to clear, leaving behind a single name spoken softly in prayer. From here, the story continues into the lands of Sumer and Akkad, where the Anunnaki once ruled, and where the roots of Yahweh's divinity reach deep into the earliest memory of gods. The crowd of the heavens may thin, but their echoes still guide us forward. Long before the first verses of the Hebrew Bible were ever written, long before Yahweh's name was carried on the lips of wandering tribes, the foundations of his story were already being laid in the deep soil of Mesopotamia. The land between the Tigris and the Euphrates was the cradle of civilization, a place where humanity's first experiments with writing, kingship and faith took root. It was there, among the reeds and clay, that the Sumerians carved the earliest blueprints of divinity, the Anunnaki, the great assembly of gods who governed heaven and earth. The Sumerians did not see their gods as abstract ideals. The Anunnaki were as real to them as the rain and the harvest. They were the keepers of balance, the invisible architects of order. Life itself was their gift, but it was also their whim. The people built temples not only to worship but to negotiate. The gods were powerful, but they could be persuaded, soothed, or angered. In that constant exchange, religion was born as conversation, a dialogue between the fragile and the eternal. The word Anunnaki meant something like those of royal blood, or offspring of Anu. Anu was the supreme sky god, distant and aloof, the source of cosmic authority. Below him were his divine descendants, the Anunnaki, who managed creation's daily affairs. Enlil, the god of air, held the tablets of destiny and commanded storms. Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh waters, shaped humanity out of clay. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, nurtured life from the soil. Together they formed a divine hierarchy that mirrored the political systems of their cities, an order that would later echo through every culture that followed. When the Akkadians absorbed Sumerian culture, they adopted its gods too, reshaping them through their own language and imagination. The Anunnaki became a vast and complex family, half administrators, half judges, ruling over both heaven and the underworld. Their stories were written on thousands of clay tablets, each line a window into the earliest human attempts to understand destiny, morality, and the meaning of existence. These stories spread outward, carried by trade and empire, until their influence reached every corner of the ancient Near East. Among the many myths that emerged from this period, one stood out for its enduring impact: the tale of the Great Flood. In Sumerian legend, the gods grew weary of humanity's noise and sent a deluge to wash the world clean. Only one man, Ziusudra, was warned in time to build a boat and save life from destruction. When the waters receded, the gods granted him immortality. This story, retold later in Akkadian as the Epic of Gilgamesh, and much later in the Hebrew Bible as the story of Noah, reveals the deep continuity between Sumerian myth and later religious thought. It was not merely the tale that survived, but the concept of divine justice, mercy, and renewal. In these ancient myths, we find the first outlines of the qualities that would one day be attributed to Yahweh: the power to create life from clay, the authority to command the flood, the role of judge, saviour, and destroyer. The Sumerian gods were not moral in the later biblical sense, but they embodied the forces that shaped existence: creation, chaos, wisdom, punishment, and forgiveness. In them, humanity projected its earliest understanding of power and responsibility. Over time, these divine patterns merged and evolved. Enlil, the storm god who ruled by decree, was both feared and revered. His voice was the wind that could bring rain or ruin. In later ages, his characteristics would reappear in other deities: Baal in Canaan, Zeus in Greece, Jupiter in Rome, and perhaps, in some distant way, Yahweh in Israel. Each new culture inherited fragments of the old, rearranging the divine traits to fit new needs and new moral visions. The gods themselves were recycled, their names fading but their roles persisting. The transition from polytheism to monotheism was not abrupt. It was a slow distillation, a refining of belief through centuries of retelling. When the early Hebrews began to articulate their own theology, they were already surrounded by echoes of Sumerian cosmology. The idea of a supreme sky god had existed for thousands of years. The concept of divine justice had been sung by poets long before Moses. Even the notion of a divine assembly, a heavenly council presided over by a ruling deity, appears in both Sumerian and early Hebrew literature. Archaeology has uncovered the physical traces of that shared heritage. Clay tablets from Nippur, dating back over 4,000 years, describe Enlil's temple, the Eka, as the mountain house, a link between heaven and earth. Later texts would describe Mount Sinai or Mount Zion in similar terms as places where the divine presence met the human world, The pattern is unmistakable. Humanity's first temples were not merely buildings, but symbolic mountains, artificial horizons where mortals could meet their makers. The Sumerians also believed that their gods communicated through chosen intermediaries, priests, kings, and prophets who received dreams or signs. These mediators were tasked with interpreting divine will for the people. This practice, too, would continue for millennia. When the Hebrew prophets later claimed to speak with Yahweh, they were standing in a very old tradition of human beings serving as translators between heaven and earth. The difference lay not in the act itself, but in the message. The Sumerian gods demanded service. The God of Israel demanded righteousness. Still, the shadow of the Anunnaki lingered behind that later revelation. The Sumerians had imagined a cosmos governed by divine decrees inscribed on the tablets of destiny. Whoever held these tablets held control over fate itself. When Yahweh later proclaimed, "I form light and create darkness, I make peace and create evil," he was asserting that same total sovereignty, the idea that all outcomes flow from one source. The language had changed, but the concept of divine control remained. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that descended from Sumerian thought, begins with a conflict among the gods, a cosmic battle between order and chaos. From that struggle emerged Marduk, the victorious god who established the world and declared himself its ruler. He organized the heavens, set the stars in their courses, and assigned duties to each deity. The parallels to later monotheistic themes are striking. Creation as the triumph of order, the elevation of one deity above all others, the transformation of myth into theology. When the Israelites encountered Babylonian culture during their exile, they encountered more than a foreign empire. They met the descendants of the very stories that had shaped their own distant ancestors. It is not hard to imagine how those ancient tales might have resonated, how they might have stirred questions about the origins of their own god, or how the exiled scribes might have reinterpreted those myths to affirm their faith. To them, Yahweh was not one among the Anunnaki, but the source from which even the gods of Babylon had borrowed their power. The mythic inheritance was inverted, redefined. What had once been a council of gods became a reflection of one divine will, and yet, beneath that redefinition, the human instinct that created the Anunnaki remained unchanged. The desire to explain the sky, to understand the unpredictable rhythm of life, to find meaning in the thunder and the flood. These were the same questions that led the Sumerians to build ziggurats and the Hebrews to build altars. Both sought connection. Both feared isolation. Both reached upward towards something that felt eternal. In the stories of the Anunnaki, one can hear the first notes of a melody that would later become the song of monotheism. Each generation added its verse, refining the idea of divinity until only one voice remained. Yahweh's emergence was not a rupture but an evolution, the next stage in a continuum of human imagination stretching back to the dawn of writing. There are tablets from ancient Nippur that describe the Anunnaki descending from the heavens to establish kingship on earth. They gave laws, set boundaries, and demanded obedience. Thousands of years later, those same motifs reappear in the biblical account of the covenant at Sinai. There, Yahweh descends in fire, gives laws, and binds a people to himself through a promise. The setting has changed, the language is different, but the pattern endures. The divine order descends, the human world responds, and history begins again. To trace Yahweh's story back to Sumer is not to diminish his uniqueness, but to understand the depth of his lineage. Every god who ever walked across human thought carries the footprints of those who came before. The Anunnaki were not forgotten. They were transformed, absorbed into new theologies that sought to make sense of an ever-changing world. Their temples became ruins, their names faded from prayer, yet their structure of belief lived on. It became the scaffolding upon which new faiths would rise. And so, as the Sumerian gods withdrew into myth, the ideas they had carried did not vanish. They travelled invisibly through language, through memory, through culture, until they reappeared in new forms. Yahweh's thunder echoed Enlil's storms. His creative word mirrored Enki's wisdom. His role as judge reflected the decrees once carved on the tablets of destiny. In him, the old world was not erased but renewed. By the time the first Hebrew scribes began to write down their stories, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia were already ancient, their bricks softened by centuries of wind and sun. Yet the foundations of their theology remained, buried beneath the dust. To tell the story of Yahweh without the Anunnaki is to begin in the middle of a sentence. The origins of monotheism lie deep in the polytheism that came before, in a lineage that stretches from the gods of Sumer to the faiths that still shape the world today. The clay tablets speak quietly, their cuneiform marks frozen in time. They tell of gods who once ruled the sky, of creation and flood, of destiny and devotion, and if one listens closely beneath the weight of millennia, one might still hear the distant echo of a name forming among them, a name that would one day rise above the rest. As the sun set on Sumer and the empires that followed, new peoples moved across the same lands, carrying their own stories and their own gods. Among them were the Canaanites, who inherited the memory of these Mesopotamian deities and gave them new voices. It was there, among their temples and altars, that Yahweh's next transformation would unfold, blending the thunder of Enlil with the majesty of El, and preparing the way for the birth of a singular faith. If you were to walk back through the ages, through the deserts and rivers where humanity first learned to name the divine, you would find that many of those names pointed upward. The sky was the great mystery, the unreachable roof of creation, the keeper of light, the realm where thunder spoke and stars kept their watch. From that endless blue vault came rain, wind, and life, but also silence, drought, and death. It was natural to imagine that the highest powers lived there, and across cultures, those powers often shared one essential form, the Sky Father, the unseen patriarch who governed all beneath him. Among the Sumerians, that figure was An, later known to the Akkadians as Anu. He was distant and silent, the supreme authority but rarely the actor in the myths. Anu delegated power to his offspring, the Anunnaki, while he remained above the storms, a symbol of divine legitimacy. His son Enlil became the more immediate ruler, the god of wind, breath, and command. To the people of Mesopotamia, Enlil's voice was the weather, his anger the flood, his favour the harvest. He was a god of decision, the arbiter of fate, and the one who spoke for the sky. When the flood legends were first written on clay, it was Enlil who decided to erase humanity, weary of their noise. It was Enki, the god of wisdom, who secretly warned the chosen survivor. In that divine conflict, later generations would see the seeds of moral tension, the idea that divine power might be tempered by compassion, that justice required mercy. These were the early whispers of theology, carried forward in stories that would outlive their temples. To the west, the Canaanites developed their own version of the Sky Father, El, the high god, the ancient one seated upon his mountain throne. His very name meant God, a title so fundamental it would echo across languages for thousands of years. In Ugaritic texts discovered at Ras Shamra, El appears as a calm, fatherly figure, the creator of all living things, the head of a divine council of younger gods. He is the source from which the rest of the pantheon flows, the one who blesses kings, judges disputes, and oversees creation. El's mountain dwelling was called the Assembly of the Gods, a place of judgment and decree. Around him gathered Baal, the storm god, Yam, the sea, Mot, death, and Asherah, the mother of gods. Together they formed a family of powers, each with a role in maintaining the rhythm of the world. Their stories were dramatic, conflicts of pride, loyalty, and rebellion, but beneath them lay a structure of belief that would prove remarkably resilient. The image of a divine father surrounded by his sons, of a high throne above the clouds, would become a template for generations of faith. In this landscape, Yahweh's later emergence makes a certain kind of sense. His earliest worshippers would have been familiar with El's authority and Enlil's storms. They would have known the idea of divine councils, of gods meeting in assembly to decide human destiny. The transition from one among many to one above all did not erase these old patterns, it inherited them. Yahweh absorbed their language, their imagery, their sense of power. The breath of Enlil, the authority of El, the command of Anu, all found new expression in the evolving theology of Israel. In early Hebrew poetry, fragments of this inheritance still glimmer. The Song of Moses, one of the oldest pieces in the Bible, speaks of the Most High, who divided the nations and gave them their lands, assigning each a portion. Yahweh, it says, received Jacob as his share. In that passage, the Most High appears distinct from Yahweh, as though one god allotted territories to others. The scene mirrors the Canaanite worldview, where El presided over his sons, each ruling a region or people. Later scribes, uncomfortable with this implication, would merge the figures, making Yahweh both the Most High and the one who received Israel. But the echo of the older pattern remains, like a shadow beneath the text. Archaeological finds reinforce this picture. Inscriptions from the ancient city of Ugarit show the name El, paired with various epithets, El Elyon, El Shaddai, El Berith, titles that would later appear in the Hebrew Bible as names of the Israelite God. These were not borrowings in the modern sense, but natural evolutions of shared language. The people of the region spoke related tongues, traded stories, and intermarried. Religion flowed as freely as goods and ideas. To speak of El was simply to speak of the divine, and Yahweh in his earliest form was understood through that same lens. Enlil's presence can also be traced in the way Yahweh is described in early Israelite writings. Like Enlil, Yahweh was a god of storm and wind. He appeared in thunder and cloud, he spoke from mountain tops and rode upon the sky. His wrath brought devastation, his breath gave life. In both traditions, the god's word was not merely speech, it was action, a force that shaped reality. When Yahweh commands light to shine or seas to part, he acts in the tradition of the Mesopotamian sky gods, whose voices once controlled creation itself. The concept of divine kingship also carries the same lineage. In Sumer, Enlil granted authority to earthly rulers, marking them as chosen intermediaries between heaven and earth. In Canaan, El bestowed kingship upon mortals, declaring them his servants and representatives. In Israel, Yahweh would become the sole giver of legitimacy, the one who raises up kings and brings them down. The continuity is striking. The divine right to rule, the covenant between heaven and humanity, the expectation of moral leadership, all trace back to those early sky fathers who governed the ancient world. But Yahweh's difference lay in what he did with that inheritance. Where Enlil's decrees were often capricious, Yahweh's were framed as just. Where El's authority was serene but distant, Yahweh's became intimate and demanding. He was not content to rule from afar. He entered into the history of his people. His power was not only in the weather or the stars, but in the conscience. He spoke through prophets, not only priests. He made morality part of the divine order, transforming religion from a system of appeasement into a covenant of responsibility. Still, it took centuries for this transformation to take hold. The early Israelites lived among neighbours who continued to honour El and Baal, and traces of that coexistence can be found even in the earliest biblical narratives. The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, refer to God by various names: El Shaddai, El Elyon, El Olam. These are titles inherited from the Canaanite El, suggesting that the line between El and Yahweh was initially blurred. Only later, as Israel's identity hardened under the pressures of history, did Yahweh emerge as distinct, absorbing the functions once shared among many. Some scholars suggest that the fusion of El and Yahweh occurred gradually, perhaps beginning in the highlands of Canaan among semi-nomadic tribes. To those people, El was the father of gods, the eternal source, while Yahweh was the active warrior deity of the desert. When their traditions merged, the result was a single god who was both creator and conqueror, distant and near. The old pantheon condensed into one being whose power encompassed all aspects of life. In that sense, the evolution from Enlil to El to Yahweh represents not a replacement but a condensation. Humanity was not abandoning the old gods so much as gathering their qualities into one. The storm, the sky, the law, the breath, all became attributes of a single divine personality. What had once been scattered across a council of gods now resided in one will, one consciousness. Monotheism was not an invention but a culmination. The transition also carried political meaning. As Israel formed its national identity, a single god mirrored the unity they sought among tribes. One deity, one covenant, one people. The image of the Sky Father provided both spiritual and social order. Just as Enlil ruled the assembly of the gods and El presided over his divine family, Yahweh became the head of a nation conceived as his household. The theological structure became a blueprint for governance shaping law, justice, and collective identity. Even so, the ancient imagery remained embedded in language. When prophets spoke of Yahweh riding on the clouds, they echoed the same titles once given to Baal. When they called him the Most High, they invoked El's throne. When they described him as a god of wind and voice, they drew on Enlil's breath. These were not coincidences, but continuities, proof that the human mind builds faith from familiar materials, layering new meaning upon old foundations. The echoes of the Sky Fathers did not disappear with monotheism. They were transfigured. Yahweh inherited their realm, their language and their power, but he also inherited their contradictions, the tension between justice and wrath, distance and closeness, silence and speech. The same sky that had once been filled with many voices now held only one, yet within that one voice were the harmonics of all that came before. Over time, the figure of Yahweh would expand beyond the bounds of weather and kingship. He would become not just the ruler of heaven, but its creator, not just the giver of law, but the source of being itself. In that expansion lay the legacy of Enlil and El, the last gifts of the Sky Fathers to the faiths that would follow. Their presence can still be felt in every prayer that begins with eyes lifted upward, in every word that speaks of heaven as home. As we move forward through the story, the landscape shifts from the skies of Sumer and Canaan to the deserts of Sinai and the tribes who carried a name across generations. There, Yahweh's transformation from a local storm god to a covenantal deity will take its next great step. The echoes of the Sky Fathers fade, but their rhythm remains in the wind, in the breath, in the thunder that still rolls over the ancient hills where faith first found its voice. The lands of Canaan were alive with contradiction. Between the fertile valleys and the barren hills stretched a mosaic of life that reflected the faith of its people, abundant and harsh, generous and unforgiving. To the west, the coastal cities flourished on trade and agriculture, their temples glittering with offerings to Baal, Asherah, and the many local gods who promised rain and harvest. To the east, across the stony deserts of Edom and Midian, nomadic tribes moved under a harder sky. Their gods were not bound to temples or cities, but to places of survival, wells, mountains, and oases. Among those wanderers, one name began to rise: Yahweh, the desert god who spoke in thunder and carried the scent of storm. In the earliest records that whisper his name, Yahweh is not yet the god of all creation. He is a figure of the wilderness, invoked by people whose lives depended on the shifting moods of the desert. Egyptian inscriptions from the late Bronze Age mention the Shasu of Yu, nomadic tribes who lived beyond the edges of empire. Their lands were barren, their paths uncertain, but their faith was fierce. They carried their God with them, a presence without temple or idol, a power tied to the elements and the promise of survival. Yahweh's domain was not a city, it was the open horizon. The desert god was unlike the gods of Canaan cities. The worship of Baal revolved around fertility, crops and rain. His image stood in carved sanctuaries, his altars thick with incense and sacrifice. El, the High Father, was a figure of wisdom and distance, ruling from a divine mountain. Yahweh's character, by contrast, was raw and immediate. He was the god of travellers, of thunderheads gathering over dry land, of wind tearing through tents. He was not approached through ritual opulence, but through endurance, faith, and fear. The harshness of his landscape became the shape of his divinity. The people who honoured him were few, yet their encounters with the settled world brought tension and exchange. As nomads traded with the farmers of Canaan, their stories and beliefs intertwined. Yahweh's thunder began to resemble Baal's storms. His mountain presence recalled El's lofty throne. But while the Canaanite gods remained tied to cycles of nature, Yahweh began to evolve towards something else, an ethical and personal bond between deity and people, a relationship defined not by ritual prosperity but by loyalty and promise. The desert, with its silence and danger, nurtured that transformation. In a world where survival depended on trust, covenants were sacred. They were the glue that held families, clans, and tribes together. To break a covenant was to invite ruin. When this social code entered religion, it reshaped the divine relationship itself. Yahweh was no longer just the bringer of rain or the voice in the storm. He became the partner in a sacred agreement, a God who chose and was chosen. The desert people projected their own values onto the divine: faithfulness, endurance, and the expectation of reciprocity. In time, this would become the central thread of Israelite theology, the covenant between God and his people. But before that covenant took form, Yahweh's image was still rugged, almost elemental. He appeared in fire and cloud, in wind and thunder. His presence inspired awe rather than comfort. The mountain was his dwelling, the storm his language. When later texts describe Yahweh descending upon Sinai in fire, they are recalling an ancient pattern, the storm god's arrival from the southern wilderness. Even as the theology matured, the imagery remained. The God of the covenant was born from the God of the storm. Archaeological finds across the Levant show how this evolution unfolded. Small shrines discovered in the highlands of Canaan bear inscriptions dedicating offerings to Yahweh of Teman, Yahweh of Samaria, and even Yahweh and his Asherah. These variations suggest that Yahweh was not yet a universal figure, but a regional deity with local attributes. He was the god of a place, a protector tied to the land and the people who named him. Only later would those regional forms merge into a single identity, purged of companions and rivals, elevated to sole divinity. The process was slow and often conflicted. The Israelites who began to settle in Canaan brought Yahweh with them, but they entered a world where Baal was already powerful. Baal was the god of rain, and in a land dependent on seasonal water, his worship made practical sense. The temptation to blend traditions was strong. In many villages, Yahweh was invoked alongside Baal, their roles overlapping. The prophets who would later denounce idolatry were not inventing a new religion. They were fighting to preserve one that was still forming, to separate the desert's god of covenant from the city's god of plenty. The confrontation between Yahweh and Baal became one of the defining dramas of early Israelite faith. It was not merely theological but symbolic, a struggle between two worlds, two economies, two ways of living. Baal's worship represented stability, agriculture, and wealth. Yahweh's represented movement, discipline, and faith amid scarcity. To follow Yahweh was to trust the unseen, to live without visible security. The covenant demanded obedience not because it was convenient, but because it was difficult. In the biblical memory, the story of the Exodus preserves this contrast in mythic form. The Israelites leave Egypt's abundance and enter the desert, where they must learn dependence on a God who provides just enough. Manna for the day, water from stone, guidance by cloud and fire. The journey is both physical and theological, from plenty to faith, from idols to covenant, from gods of harvest to a God of promise. In that crucible, Yahweh's identity hardens into something unlike any of his predecessors. The covenant, when it finally takes shape, transforms divine power into moral relationship. Yahweh demands not offerings of grain or gold, but justice, mercy, and fidelity. The old ritual economy of appeasement gives way to an ethical one. To please the god is to live rightly. To honour the covenant is to treat others with fairness. The shift is revolutionary. It marks the moment when religion begins to turn inward, when the storm outside becomes a mirror for the conscience within. Yet even as Yahweh becomes a moral lawgiver, his voice still carries the thunder of his origins. The prophets who later speak of him describe his power in elemental terms. Amos, one of the earliest, pictures Yahweh roaring from Zion and shaking the heavens. Habakkuk sees him marching from the south, his brightness like lightning. These images preserve the memory of the desert god, the traveller from Teman, the one who rose in storm and descended in covenant. The theology may have changed, but the imagery remained rooted in the landscape that birthed it. The transformation from storm to covenant also mirrors the journey of the people themselves, from nomads to nation, from survival to purpose. As they settled the land, built cities and developed laws, Yahweh changed with them. He became not only the God of the wilderness but of history, guiding them through wars, alliances and exiles. His covenant expanded from the tribe to the kingdom, from the individual to the community. The desert god became the architect of destiny. Still, traces of his earlier nature survived in language and ritual. The festivals of Israel retained echoes of agricultural cycles once tied to Baal. The Ark of the Covenant, carried in battle, recalled the portable shrines of nomadic worship. Even the prohibition against graven images may reflect Yahweh's origin as a god without idols, a deity of word and presence rather than form. Each commandment, each story, each prayer carried a fragment of that wilderness memory. The sound of wind over sand, the glow of fire on stone. To the people of Canaan, the sky was a living theatre of gods. Thunder was argument, lightning decree, rain approval. To the Israelites, those same signs came to mean something more intimate. The storm was no longer the battle of rival deities, but the voice of one. The rain was not merely blessing, but covenantal faithfulness. The desert god had become the moral compass of his people, and the storm had become the symbol of his enduring power. As centuries passed, this vision deepened. Yahweh's presence was no longer confined to the desert or the mountain. He became the God who travelled with his people wherever they went, from the highlands of Canaan to the cities of exile. His covenant was not written only on stone, but carried in memory and song. And yet, beneath all that evolution, the sound of the storm still lingered, the heartbeat of a God who once spoke from clouds over an empty land. The story of Yahweh's journey from the wilderness into covenant is the story of how humanity transformed fear into faith. The same thunder that once frightened shepherds in the night became the voice of reassurance. The same desert that once symbolized isolation became the setting for divine presence. From storm to covenant, from raw power to moral purpose, Yahweh's evolution mirrored humanity's own search for meaning in a world both beautiful and perilous. As the people of Israel began to write their histories and laws, they looked back on that transformation and saw in it the hand of destiny. Their God had not only guided them through the wilderness, but reshaped the meaning of divinity itself. And as their neighbours continued to bow before pantheons of many gods, Israel carried forward the radical idea that one God could encompass all, a God who began in storm, dwelt in covenant, and would one day become the measure of eternity. Beyond the deserts and valleys, however, the story was far from finished. For even as Yahweh's identity deepened in covenant, new discoveries and migrations would connect his name to the very earliest roots of humanity's divine imagination. To follow that thread, one must return to the highlands and nomads who first spoke his name, and to the inscriptions carved by hands long vanished, the Shasu of Yu, the travellers who carried the god of storms across the sands of time. Long before the scrolls of the Torah were written, before the kingdoms of Israel and Judah drew their borders upon the land, and before the idea of Yahweh as the one true God took form, there were wanderers moving through the deserts between Egypt, Canaan and Arabia. They were called the Shasu, a name the Egyptians used for the semi-nomadic tribes who lived beyond their fortified borders. In Egyptian records, carved on temple walls at Soleb and Amara West during the reigns of Amenhotep III and Rameses II, the Shasu appear as a people of the wilderness, unruly, elusive, and difficult to govern. Among the many groups listed, one bears a remarkable designation, the Shasu of Yurubu. It is one of the earliest known appearances of the divine name that would later define Israel's faith. To the Egyptian scribes, this name was just another geographical or tribal marker. They likely did not grasp the weight it would one day carry. The inscription places the Shasu of Yu somewhere in the region south of Canaan near Edom, Seir and Midian, lands of rugged mountains, copper mines and endless wind. This was not the fertile land of Baal's rains or the walled cities of El's worship. It was an austere world of sand, stone and sky, where survival itself felt like a form of devotion. It was here, scholars believe, that the cult of Yahweh may have first taken shape. The Shasu were herders, traders, and travellers. They moved in small bands following grazing routes and caravan trails. They were not empire builders or temple priests. Their religion, like their lives, was portable. A god who could travel with them, who could appear on mountain tops or in the wilderness, suited their existence. Theirs was not a faith of ritual luxury, but of endurance, a theology of dust, hunger and awe. If Yahweh's earliest worshippers were among the Shasu, then his character was born not in royal courts or city temples, but in the loneliness of open land. His name may have been whispered around campfires, invoked in storms, or etched into stone by travellers seeking protection. The mountains of Seir and Midian, mentioned repeatedly in early biblical poetry, seem to echo this memory. The Book of Judges describes Yahweh coming from Seir, shining forth from Mount Paran. The prophet Habakkuk later writes of God marching from Taman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, his glory covering the heavens. These verses preserve a geography of worship rooted in the south, a memory of a God who came not from the urban centres of Canaan, but from its wilderness edges. The association between Yahweh and the mountains is more than symbolic. In ancient Near Eastern belief, mountains were the natural meeting places between heaven and earth. They were the thrones of gods, the pillars of creation. The Sumerians had their ziggurats, the Babylonians their stepped towers, all imitating the sacred mountain where the divine and the mortal could commune. For the nomads of the desert, the mountains themselves were temples. Their peaks touched the sky. Their caves offered refuge and mystery. In that setting, a god of storms and revelation would have seemed close enough to hear. Yahweh's earliest worship may have been tied to sacred mountains such as Sinai or Horeb, names that later traditions would immortalize. In those early days, there were no tablets of law, no organized priesthood, only the raw experience of the divine, wind that shook the tents, thunder that rolled through the valleys, fire that appeared on mountain tops. The encounter with Yahweh was not mediated by ritual, but by survival. He was the God who saw from above, who could bring rain or ruin, who demanded respect born not from doctrine but from fear and gratitude. As the Shasu moved through the southern deserts, their interactions with settled peoples introduced their God to others. Traders carried not only goods, but stories. Caravan routes were arteries of culture, carrying fragments of belief across borders. The Canaanites, always absorbing and adapting, may have heard of this desert god of storms and folded him into their vast pantheon. Over time, Yahweh's name spread northward, passing from tribe to tribe, until it reached the highlands where the early Israelites would one day make their home. But Yahweh's origin among the Shasu carried a distinct character that would never fully disappear. He was a god of mobility, not monument. Even when later generations built temples and composed psalms, they remembered that their god had once walked with nomads, dwelling in tents as they did. The Ark of the Covenant, carried from place to place, reflected this memory, a divine presence that travelled, rested, and rose again. The Israelites' conception of a God who tabernacled among his people, who moved with them rather than waiting to be approached, comes directly from this desert heritage. The hiddenness of Yahweh's name may also trace back to these origins. Among the Shasu, divine names were not spoken lightly. To know a god's name was to hold power, to invite presence, or even to risk danger. In many ancient cultures, names were treated as living things, sacred, potent, and sometimes perilous. The later Israelite prohibition against uttering the divine name may have preserved this ancient fear. The god of the wilderness was not to be taken casually. His name, like the desert itself, was something approached with reverence and caution. In time, as Yahweh's worship merged with that of El and took root among the Israelites, the old southern geography was reinterpreted. The journey from Egypt to Sinai became a story of revelation, of law given on a mountain, of a covenant sealed between God and people. The Shasu's rugged homeland was transformed into sacred history. What had once been the terrain of nomads became the stage for divine encounter. The God who once belonged to a tribe of wanderers became the God who led all Israel through the wilderness. The landscape remained the same, but its meaning deepened. Archaeological traces suggest that Yahweh's earliest shrines were simple. Stones arranged in circles, altars of uncut rock, sometimes placed on mountain slopes. There were no idols. The god of the storm was present in the elements themselves. Fire symbolized his arrival, wind his breath, rain his mercy. When later prophets described Yahweh's appearance as wrapped in cloud and flame, they were not inventing metaphors. They were recalling the way their ancestors experienced divinity in nature's violence and beauty. The connection between Yahweh and Midian is particularly intriguing. The biblical story of Moses, who fled Egypt and found refuge in Midian, may preserve a memory of cultural contact between early Israelites and Midianite tribes. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, is described as a priest of Midian, and it is through him that Moses learns the name of God. The burning bush, the mountain of revelation, the encounter in the wilderness, all of these elements align with the geography of the Shasu of Yu. The story may encode an older truth, that Yahweh's name came from the south, from a people who lived between empires and saw the divine in the silence of ungoverned land. The Shasu's world was one of constant movement. Their lives depended on reading the land, the direction of the wind, the behaviour of animals, the signs of approaching weather. It is easy to imagine how, in such a world, the divine would be understood as something living, active, and unpredictable. Yahweh's later identity as a god who acts in history, who intervenes and commands, mirrors the way the Shasu experienced existence itself. Always on the edge of change, always at the mercy of forces beyond control. The transition from a tribal deity of the desert to the universal God of Israel was gradual, almost invisible in its early stages. The Shasu's Yahweh was one among many regional gods, but he carried with him qualities that allowed for transformation. He was untied to place or image. He was defined by movement, by voice, by covenant, rather than by cult. These traits made him uniquely adaptable to a people whose identity would be shaped by migration, exile, and return. When the Israelites eventually settled in Canaan and began to form their distinct culture, they did not leave the desert behind. They brought it with them in their stories, in their worship, in their understanding of God. The prophets would later remind them of it again and again. I led you through the wilderness. I found you in a desert land. Remember the days of old. The desert was not just a memory. It was a theology. It taught that faith was trust without proof, loyalty without comfort, and endurance without guarantee. The Shasu of Yu may have vanished from history, their names lost to time, but their legacy endures in every trace of Yahweh's character that carries the scent of dust and wind. The God who walked with nomads became the God who walked with a nation. The hidden name inscribed on Egyptian stone became the most sacred word in Scripture, and the mountains that once marked the boundaries of forgotten tribes became the holy ground where humanity first learned to speak with the divine. From the deserts of Edom to the hills of Canaan, the journey of Yahweh's name was more than the spread of a religion. It was the migration of an idea, that divinity could dwell not in stone or idol, but in relationship, in movement, in the quiet promise between the human heart and the unseen. The Shasu carried that idea across the sands of centuries, leaving behind only a faint mark on the walls of an Egyptian temple. Yet in that mark lay the seed of a faith that would one day circle the world. As the winds continue to sweep over those same barren hills, the echoes of their faith still seem to whisper through the emptiness. Somewhere among the rocks and stars the ancient name lingers, a name once spoken by wanderers, carried by mountains, hidden from kings, and remembered forever. There is a quiet moment in human history when the many voices of heaven begin to fade into one. It is not sudden, not a revolution of fire or decree, but a long and uncertain transition, a slow narrowing of the sky. In the ancient lands of Canaan, where every hill had its shrine and every household its god, the idea that there could be only one divine being seemed almost unthinkable. Yet, from that landscape of plural worship, a single god would rise to rule the conscience of half the world. The path to monotheism was not carved in a day, nor was it born from philosophy. It grew from centuries of memory, migration, and struggle. The Israelites, a small people living among great empires, carried within them the memory of a God who had no equal among the nations. Yahweh had begun as one God among many, a stormbringer, a desert protector, a covenantal presence in the wilderness. But the journey from that early form to the idea of the one true God was a story of survival as much as belief. In the beginning, the Israelites were not strict monotheists. Their earliest texts and inscriptions reveal a world still alive with divine plurality. In the hills and valleys of Canaan, they worshipped Yahweh, but traces of Asherah, Baal, and El lingered beside him. Excavations from sites like Kuntilet Ajrud and Kirbet el-Kom show inscriptions that speak of Yahweh and his Asherah, suggesting a time when the divine was still understood in family terms, as it had been for centuries across the Near East. The gods had companions, consorts, and councils. Yahweh's eventual isolation, his elevation above all others, would take generations of prophets, poets, and reformers. The world around Israel was saturated with polytheism. In Mesopotamia, the great gods of old, Anu, Enlil, and Marduk, still ruled their temples. In Egypt, Amun, Ra, and Isis guided the order of life and death. In Canaan, Baal's thunder was the sound of renewal, while Asherah's presence lingered in the groves and poles that dotted the landscape. Every culture had its pantheon, and every household had its idols. Faith was a matter of locality. Each god had its territory, its people, its realm. To worship was to affirm belonging. For the Israelites, Yahweh was originally such a god, a tribal protector, a patron of their confederation of tribes. He led them from bondage, fought their battles, and promised them land. But even as they entered Canaan, their devotion coexisted with older practices. Archaeological evidence and the oldest biblical poems suggest that early Israelite religion was henotheistic rather than monotheistic, a system where one god was exalted without denying the existence of others. The phrase, "Who is like you among the gods, O Yahweh," from the Song of the Sea reflects this stage. Yahweh is supreme among the gods, not yet the only god. The shift toward monotheism began not in prosperity but in crisis. When kingdoms fall, when certainties collapse, belief often changes. The people of Israel, once united under kings like David and Solomon, fractured into two realms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The northern kingdom, surrounded by powerful neighbours, adopted elements of their worship, blending Yahweh with Baal, merging festivals and building altars in his name but with foreign symbols. Prophets arose to condemn this blending, to demand a return to purity. Elijah, standing on Mount Carmel, called down fire from heaven to prove that Yahweh alone had power over the storm. His contest with the prophets of Baal was not just a miracle story. It was a turning point in theology. It declared that Yahweh was not merely the strongest God, but the only one worth naming. But this conviction still needed time to grow. When the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom in the 8th century BCE, the survivors fled south to Judah, bringing their traditions and trauma with them. Jerusalem became a refuge not only for people, but for ideas. The priests and scribes of Judah began to gather, edit and rewrite their traditions, shaping them into a story of divine exclusivity. In this period, the seeds of monotheism took root. The reforms of King Hezekiah and later of King Josiah were crucial in this process. Both sought to centralize worship in Jerusalem, tearing down local shrines and outlawing the high places where people had long made offerings. The goal was to bring all worship under the control of the temple, to unify the nation under one God and one sanctuary. In doing so, they also reshaped theology. The many local Yahwehs of the countryside, the Yahweh of Samaria, the Yahweh of Teman, became one Yahweh, the Lord of all the earth. The idea of a god bound to a region gave way to a god who ruled the universe. These reforms met resistance, of course. Faith does not change by decree. The rural families who had worshipped at their ancestral altars for generations did not easily abandon their traditions. The prophets railed against idolatry precisely because it persisted. But the idea of Yahweh's uniqueness continued to spread. The experience of national calamity gave it strength. When Jerusalem itself fell to Babylon in 586 BCE and its temple was destroyed, the Israelites faced a question that no polytheist would ever need to ask. If our God is tied to our land, what happens when we lose the land? The exile forced a new understanding. In a foreign city surrounded by foreign gods, the prophets of Israel began to declare something unheard of, that Yahweh was not just the God of one nation, but the God of all nations. He was not defeated by Babylon. He had allowed Babylon to triumph as an instrument of judgment. His power extended beyond borders, beyond temples, beyond kings. For the first time in recorded history, divinity was divorced from geography. God was no longer local, he was universal. This idea found its clearest voice in the writings attributed to the prophet known as 2nd Isaiah, composed during or after the exile. In his vision, Yahweh declares, "I am the Lord, and there is no other. Beside me, there is no God." The old world of competing deities had ended. The heavens, once crowded with divine beings, were now empty except for one. Even the stars, once thought to be living gods, were reduced to servants of his will. The transformation was theological, but it was also psychological. A people who had lost everything found meaning in the belief that their God was still in control. Monotheism was not just an assertion of faith, it was a defense against despair. If Yahweh alone was real, then defeat was not abandonment but discipline. Exile was not chaos but purpose. In this way, theology became survival. The shift from polytheism to monotheism also reshaped morality. In a world of many gods, ethics was fragmented. Each deity demanded different rituals, different loyalties. In a world of one God, morality could be unified. The divine will became singular, and with it came the idea of universal justice. The prophets began to speak not only of ritual purity, but of righteousness, compassion, and social responsibility. To serve Yahweh was no longer to perform sacrifices, but to seek justice, to defend the oppressed, to love mercy. Religion moved from the temple to the conscience. Even so, the memory of the old pantheon never completely vanished. The language of divine counsel persisted in poetry and psalm. Angels replaced the gods as messengers. The term Elohim, once plural, was reinterpreted as a singular noun. The transformation was as much linguistic as theological, a reshaping of words to fit a new vision of reality. Yahweh's old rivals were demoted, redefined, or absorbed. Baal became a byword for falsehood, Asherah a forgotten presence. El name merged into the divine title. The many faces of divinity were gathered into one. By the time the exiles returned from Babylon, monotheism was no longer a fragile idea. It was the foundation of their identity. The temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt, but the people who entered it were changed. They had seen a world where gods were everywhere, and they had come to believe that only one voice spoke behind them all. This conviction would shape everything that followed: the birth of Judaism, the rise of Christianity, and the emergence of Islam. The legacy of that transformation would extend far beyond the hills where it began. And yet, if one listens closely to the ancient texts, there are still traces of the older world. The imagery of storm and fire, the mountain of revelation, the divine council, all these linger like fossils within the rock of monotheism. The God who became one still carries the memory of the many. His singular voice contains the echoes of 1,000 older prayers, spoken by ancestors who looked at the same sky and heard the same thunder. The rise of monotheism in Israel was not merely the triumph of one belief over another, it was the refinement of humanity's search for coherence. In Yahweh's transformation from tribal God to universal being, people found a mirror of their own journey, from the uncertainty of survival to the hope of meaning, from the chaos of many to the unity of one. And as the centuries unfolded, the vision of one God would expand again, shaped by poets, priests, and prophets who saw in Yahweh not just power, but purpose. The God of the covenant would become the God of creation, and the faith of a small people in a narrow land would become a story that redefined the divine horizon for all who came after. Beyond that turning point lay another stage in the evolution. The voices of those who would speak for this single God, who would declare his justice and his mercy, and in doing so solidify monotheism as more than belief, as a moral revolution. The prophets were coming, and through them, the fire of Yahweh would take shape in words that still burn quietly through the centuries. The prophets were the voice that rose from the ashes of confusion, a bridge between ruin and revelation. They appeared not in times of peace, but in the uneasy spaces where nations trembled, where certainty collapsed, and where faith itself seemed to waver. Israel had lived among gods for centuries, seen their shrines, heard their hymns, borrowed their language, but now a new world was being shaped. The prophet stood at its threshold, holding a fire that would burn away the remnants of the old. Their task was not gentle. They spoke in storms, in parables, in warnings that shook kings and terrified crowds. They were not priests or scholars. They were messengers, seized by the conviction that Yahweh alone was real, that every idol carved from stone or wood was a lie, that divinity could no longer be shared among the many. Their message was monotheism, but it came clothed in urgency. For them, this was not a matter of philosophy. It was a matter of survival. When Elijah stood on Mount Carmel, calling fire from heaven, the confrontation with Baal was more than a contest of miracles. It was the symbolic death of the old world. Before the assembled people, 2 altars waited, one for Yahweh, one for Baal. The priests of Baal danced and shouted, cutting themselves, pleading for their god to answer. The sky remained silent. Then Elijah, calm and alone, prayed once, and fire fell from heaven, consuming the sacrifice and the stones alike. The crowd fell silent, and in that silence the theology of Israel took a decisive turn. Yahweh was not merely the most powerful God, he was the only one who could answer. The fire was his signature, the proof that no other voice shared the heavens. Elijah's successors would continue that mission, though few would see such spectacle. Amos, a shepherd from Tekoa, came speaking not of miracles but of justice. His words were dry as the hills, sharp as desert wind. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. He took the storm god's imagery and turned it inward. The thunder was now moral, the lightning ethical. Yahweh's wrath was not against rival deities, but against cruelty, greed, and corruption. The divine fire had become conscience. Hosea followed, carrying the same flame but with a different voice. His prophecies were filled with sorrow, using the language of love betrayed and restored. Israel's unfaithfulness was not a political failure, but a spiritual one, a marriage broken by idolatry. Yahweh was not only a judge but a wounded partner, a God who desired relationship, who grieved for his people's disloyalty. In Hosea's voice the divine began to sound human, yet his humanity made him greater, not smaller. The old gods had demanded offerings, this one demanded hearts. Isaiah transformed that fire again. In his vision, Yahweh's holiness was overwhelming, consuming and pure. And holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the seraphim cry in his dream, their voices shaking the thresholds of heaven. Isaiah's God is not merely stronger than the others, he is fundamentally different. He cannot be represented, confined or compared. He fills the universe, transcending the old categories of divine rivalry. Through Isaiah, Yahweh becomes cosmic, no longer the God of a nation but the architect of all history. He raises empires and shatters them, not because they offend him, but because they serve his plan. The fire that burned on Mount Carmel now burns in every event, every triumph, every tragedy. The prophets spoke of Yahweh as both near and beyond, present in every storm and yet beyond all storms. Their words reshaped theology, erasing the last traces of the pantheon that had haunted Israel's past. But their message was more than doctrine. It was defiance. In a world ruled by empires that worshipped many gods, Assyria with its winged lions, Babylon with its ziggurats, the prophets dared to say that those empires were illusions of power. Their gods were idols, their might temporary. The only enduring reality was Yahweh, whose fire could not be extinguished, whose word could not be silenced. Jeremiah carried that word into the heart of collapse. As Jerusalem burned and its people were led into exile, he declared that Yahweh's presence was not tied to the temple or the land. The true temple, he said, was obedience. The true sacrifice was contrition. The destruction of the physical sanctuary was not the death of faith, but its purification. Yahweh could no longer be contained in stone. He lived in the heart. That realization would transform Judaism forever, turning catastrophe into theology. Ezekiel, exiled by the river Chebar, saw visions that burned brighter than any temple lamp. He saw Yahweh enthroned on wheels of fire, moving across the heavens, no longer confined to one place. In his visions, God was dynamic, alive, capable of movement, a continuation of the desert deity who had once travelled with the nomads. The presence that once filled Sinai now filled the universe. Yahweh had become everywhere. The exilic prophets, shaped by loss, did not diminish their God. They expanded him. Their message was both comfort and challenge. Comfort, because Yahweh was still near. Challenge, because no one could claim him as their own. He was no longer the private deity of Israel, but the Lord of all nations. Even the conquerors, Babylon, Persia, and beyond, were instruments of his will. History itself had become his stage. And yet, within that expansion, the prophets never let the fire cool. They spoke not of abstract unity, but of moral clarity. "Seek good and not evil, that you may live," Amos said. "What does the Lord require of you?" asked Micah. "But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." These were not the words of philosophers, but of people who had seen power destroy itself, who knew that divine truth meant more than victory. Yahweh's uniqueness was measured not by conquest, but by compassion. The fire of the prophets burned in many forms: judgment, vision, promise, but always it purified. It stripped away idols not only of stone but of thought, forcing humanity to confront a new understanding of the divine. Where the old gods were bound by nature, Yahweh became the creator of nature itself. Where the old gods demanded sacrifice, Yahweh demanded change. The fire no longer consumed offerings. It refined souls. Through them, Yahweh's image evolved from a storm god thundering over deserts to a moral presence shaping destiny. Their words turned faith into a dialogue, not a transaction. The covenant, once a pact between tribe and God, became an inner compass, a reflection of divine will in human life. The prophets turned belief from ritual to responsibility, from fear to meaning. Their work did not end with them. The exiles scattered their words like embers, carried into new lands, new languages, and new minds. In Babylon, among foreign gods and foreign customs, the exiles remembered their prophets and reinterpreted their message. Yahweh was not defeated. He was the author of exile itself, guiding his people through it as he had through the wilderness. The fire had become portable again, a light carried within. When the exiles returned and rebuilt the temple, the prophet's legacy endured in the structure of thought itself. Worship had changed, theology had matured. The divine was now singular, moral, universal. The gods of the old world had vanished into myth, and in their place stood one presence whose fire could be felt in every age. Through their words, the prophets turned history into revelation. Every empire that rose and fell became a sentence in a larger story, each event a spark in the divine fire. Their vision unified heaven and earth under one law, one purpose, one voice. And though the fire they carried often burned with judgment, its light revealed something new, the possibility of redemption, of renewal, of return. The prophets defined Yahweh not only by power but by character. He was no longer one voice among many but the measure of all truth. The divine had been defined alone, purified through fire, sealed in word. The transformation was complete, but the story was not. For the fire that burned through the prophet's words would pass into the hands of the scribes who followed them, those who would write the divine into history and fix his voice into text, ensuring that the flame would never be forgotten. When the fire of the prophets dimmed and the echoes of their voices dissolved into exile, what remained was silence. Not the silence of abandonment, but of transformation. A new kind of revelation was beginning to take shape, no longer spoken by thunder or inscribed on stone tablets, but written carefully by human hands. The age of visionaries gave way to the age of scribes. Yahweh, once known through storm and covenant, began to dwell in words. It was through writing that he would outlive every temple, every empire, every exile. The destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians was a trauma that split Israel's memory in two. Everything that had defined their identity, the land, the kingship, the priesthood, was gone. The place where Yahweh's name had dwelled, where sacrifice and celebration had sustained generations, lay in ruins. The people were scattered across a foreign empire whose gods towered in stone. In that dislocation, theology itself began to evolve. The question was no longer where Yahweh lived, but how he could be remembered. For centuries, the Israelites had known their God through presence: a pillar of fire, a cloud on the mountain, a voice in the desert, the ark carried into battle. But in Babylon, presence became absence. There was no temple, no ark, no visible sign. The exile stripped faith to its essence and forced a new kind of worship, one that depended not on place but on memory, and memory needed preservation. The written word became the new sanctuary. The scribes who began to collect, edit, and compose Israel's sacred texts were not inventing their God. They were rebuilding him from the fragments of history. They gathered oral traditions, songs, laws, and chronicles, some older than any kingdom, and wove them into a single narrative, Each scroll was a stone in a new kind of temple, each word a ritual act. Writing became prayer. The act of transcription itself was a form of faith, a statement that Yahweh could not be erased so long as his story was told. In exile, stories that had once circulated separately were unified into a larger vision. The creation myths of Genesis, the ancestral tales of Abraham, the Exodus from Egypt, the laws of Moses, all were given structure, rhythm, and purpose. The scribes arranged history not as a random sequence of events, but as a pattern of covenant and consequence. Every rise and fall, every exile and return was part of a divine plan. Through narrative, they transformed chaos into meaning. The gods of Babylon could be defeated by time. Yahweh's word, once written, could not. This process was neither quick nor simple. It stretched across generations, blending voices from different eras and perspectives. Some wrote from the grief of exile, others from the hope of return. Some were priests preserving ritual lore, others were poets turning memory into song. Together they gave form to what would become the Hebrew Bible, a work that was not merely historical but theological, not merely descriptive but interpretive. It was history as faith, faith as history. The Babylonian exile also introduced a paradox that reshaped Israel's understanding of the divine. Yahweh, who had once been worshipped in one temple by one nation, was now encountered through text by a scattered people. He had become portable again, like the god of the Shasu, moving wherever his words were read. The temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed, but a new temple had been built in thought. The scroll replaced the altar. The study of scripture replaced the sacrifice. When the Persian king Cyrus allowed the exiles to return home, many did, but the world they came back to was different. The old monarchy was gone, replaced by imperial administration. The temple was rebuilt, but smaller, simpler, more a symbol than a seat of power. What had survived the exile was not the building, but the book. Yahweh's identity was now bound to language, not architecture. In this new order, the scribes, those who knew how to read, interpret and preserve the text, became the keepers of divine authority. Where once priests had mediated between God and people through ritual, now scholars did so through words. The written law became sacred, not because it described holiness, but because it embodied it. In the scrolls, Yahweh was no longer merely remembered, he was alive. His voice spoke through ink, his presence lingered in the space between lines. The divine had entered time through narrative. The transformation from temple to text also marked a shift in how faith was experienced. In the temple, worship was collective, bound to place and season. In the text, worship became personal, portable, reflective. A person could encounter Yahweh alone, reading by lamplight, reciting psalms, tracing the letters that carried his name. The divine became accessible through memory and study, not just through ritual. This democratization of the sacred would shape all later monotheistic traditions. But the transition was not without tension. Some longed for the grandeur of the old days, the smoke of sacrifice, the music of festivals, the certainty of priestly mediation. Others saw in the new written faith a deeper, purer connection, one that could not be destroyed by foreign armies. The prophets had declared that Yahweh's word would endure forever. The scribes made that declaration literal. In the centuries that followed, the texts continued to grow, absorbing history as it unfolded. Chronicles, psalms, wisdom literature, and later prophecies all joined the evolving canon. The divine became increasingly abstract yet intimate, a moral presence rather than a physical one. Yahweh was no longer confined to the storm or the mountain, but resided in meaning itself. To understand him was to interpret the text. To read the text was to participate in revelation. The exilic and post-exilic scribes gave the world a theology of memory. Their work turned history into scripture, and in doing so they gave faith endurance beyond geography. The Babylonians who destroyed the temple vanished. The Persians who freed the exiles faded into empire, but the scrolls remained. They carried within them the idea that words could outlast walls, that thought could survive where stone could not. Yahweh's dwelling place was no longer a structure built by human hands, but a story told by human voices. This evolution also redefined the nature of revelation. In the ancient world, divine communication had been episodic: dreams, visions, the occasional prophet. Now, revelation became continuous. Each reading, each interpretation, each rewriting of the text was a renewal of divine dialogue. Yahweh's word was not static. It was alive, unfolding across time. The same fire that had once burned in Elijah's altar now burned quietly in language, in the rhythm of law and narrative. Through writing, the people of Israel created something unprecedented, a God who was not only believed in but documented. Their faith became history, and their history became faith. Every event from the Exodus to the exile was reinterpreted as a manifestation of divine purpose. Even defeat was proof of sovereignty. In the act of recording, Yahweh's followers ensured that their God could not be forgotten, even if they were. As generations passed, the written word became the cornerstone of identity. The study of Torah was no longer merely scholarship, it was worship. To write was to remember, to read was to relive, to copy was to sustain creation itself. The ink and parchment became sacred materials, mediating between the human and the divine. In a sense, the scribes were building a new kind of temple, one made of sentences and scrolls, carried from place to place, immune to conquest. The transition from temple to text also carried profound implications for how humanity conceived of God. A written deity could not be seen, touched, or confined. He could be known only through interpretation. This shift moved faith from the visible to the invisible, from object to idea. It was the final stage of Yahweh's transformation, from one among the gods to the ineffable source of all meaning. The old gods had lived in idols, images, and rituals. Yahweh now lived in abstraction, in thought, in word. By the time the last books of the Hebrew Bible were written, Yahweh had become timeless, transcendent, beyond the cycles of nature and empire. His presence no longer depended on fire or stone, but on remembrance. The divine word had become the divine being. To preserve the text was to preserve the God. The story that began with nomads and mountains, with storms and covenants, now continued in libraries and schools, in recitations and prayers. The evolution was complete. From experience to record, from vision to verse, from temple to text. The God who once dwelled among clouds now lived in language, carried in the hearts of those who spoke his name and those who dared not. And as those texts spread and endured, as they were copied and reinterpreted through exile after exile, Yahweh's voice continued to grow quieter but deeper, stretching beyond Israel, beyond history, until his story became the world's story. The moment when the divine was not only worshipped, but written into time itself. From here, the journey leads to the return from exile, to the merging of myth and memory that shaped Yahweh's final identity. The God who had once walked among gods, now standing alone, his reflection still faintly visible in the civilizations that had given him form, the Babylonian, the Persian, and the forgotten Sumerian before them. The fire had become a word, and the word had become eternal. The story of Yahweh cannot be told without the sound of Babylon beneath it, the hum of empire, the clang of gates, the slow rhythm of rivers winding through foreign lands. It was there, among the ziggurats and walls of a city that claimed to reach the heavens, that Israel's faith faced its greatest trial. In Babylon, everything that had once given shape to belief was gone. The temple was ash, the ark lost, the monarchy broken. The people were captives in a land whose gods seemed victorious, whose culture was vast, whose monuments stood as proof of divine favour. And yet, from that place of defeat, Israel would emerge not only restored, but transformed. The Babylonian exile was not the end of Yahweh's story, it was its rebirth. The exile began as punishment, at least in the language of the prophets. Jeremiah had warned that the people's idolatry would bring ruin, that the temple they trusted had become an illusion of safety. When the Babylonians came, burning Jerusalem and carrying away its elite, it seemed as though his grim vision had come true. Yet in that desolation, something extraordinary happened. Deprived of land and ritual, the Israelites began to redefine what it meant to be chosen. If their God's house could fall, perhaps his presence was never limited to it. If his people could live among foreigners, perhaps his power extended beyond borders. The shock of exile opened a vast horizon. In Babylon, Yahweh became the first truly portable God of history. He no longer needed a mountain, a sanctuary, or a priesthood to be real. He lived in memory, in scripture, in song. The psalmist's lament, "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" was not despair but transition. Singing in exile was the act that preserved identity. Prayer became rebellion. Each recitation of law or story was resistance against absorption. The Babylonians had conquered bodies, not faith. The influence of Babylon on Israelite thought was deep and complex. The exiles encountered one of the most sophisticated cultures of the ancient world, a civilization that had been shaping ideas of divinity for millennia. Its myths were old, its philosophy mature. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, spoke of a god who brought order out of chaos by the word of his command. The parallels with Genesis are striking, not as copies, but as conversations. The Israelites heard echoes of their own tradition in Babylonian form, and through that reflection, they clarified what made their God different. In the Babylonian vision, creation emerged from conflict. The god Marduk slaying the sea dragon Tiamat and fashioning the world from her body. In the Israelite retelling, creation came not from violence but from speech. Yahweh did not conquer chaos, he named it. Light and darkness, sky and sea, all came to be through word alone. The myth of struggle became a theology of peace. Where Babylon saw divinity as the product of might, Israel saw it as the source of meaning. Other elements of Babylonian thought seeped quietly into Hebrew theology. The idea of cosmic justice, of divine decrees shaping history, of the heavens as a realm of order, all were reinterpreted through monotheism. The Israelites adopted Babylon's language of empire and inverted it. Where Babylon exalted its king as the image of God, Israel declared that all humanity was made in God's image. What Babylon had used to justify power, Israel used to affirm equality. The exile also reshaped the understanding of time. Babylon measured history in cycles, the turning of stars, the repetition of reigns. Israel, through the experience of exile, began to see time as linear, purposeful, unfolding toward redemption. This shift would become one of the most enduring legacies of Jewish thought, the belief that history itself is a journey with direction, that suffering has meaning, that return is not repetition, but fulfillment. While the Babylonians built temples to preserve their gods, the exiles built memory to preserve theirs. Communities gathered by the rivers of the city, reciting the stories of Abraham, of Moses, of covenant and promise. In those gatherings, oral tradition turned into scripture. What had been fragmented, poems, laws, chronicles, was bound together under the pressure of displacement. Babylon, the city of many gods, ironically gave birth to the literature of the one God. Even linguistically, traces of Babylon lingered. The Hebrew language absorbed Aramaic words, and with them a new rhythm of thought. The imagery of the heavens as layered realms, the concept of angels as cosmic messengers, the idea of a written book of life, all these motifs took shape or deepened in exile. Babylon did not erase Yahweh, it refined him. He emerged from captivity larger, more abstract, more universal. The prophets who lived through the exile saw this transformation as divine intent. Ezekiel's vision of Yahweh on a chariot of fire, rising, moving, unbound by temple or land, was a theology of exile. God had not been defeated. He had expanded beyond his old dwelling. 2nd Isaiah, writing near the end of the captivity, made the final declaration, "Before me no God was formed, nor shall there be after me." The age of rivals was over. Monotheism was no longer a theological experiment, it was a statement of survival. When the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon and allowed the exiles to return home, the event was interpreted not as political fortune, but as divine fulfillment. Yahweh, it seemed, had used even foreign kings to accomplish his will. In the decree of Cyrus, the Israelites saw providence. In their return, they saw restoration. Yet they returned to a homeland that was no longer the same. The land was scarred, the temple gone, the tribes dispersed. They had to rebuild not only walls, but meaning. The second temple that rose in Jerusalem was humbler than the first. It lacked the ark, the visible symbols of presence. Yet it stood as proof that memory could be rebuilt into structure. The rituals resumed, the festivals returned, but the faith had changed. Yahweh was now understood as the God of heaven and earth, not merely of Zion. The prayers once confined to the temple could now rise from anywhere. Worship had been internalized. The exile had turned a national religion into a universal faith. Babylon's influence continued even after its empire faded. The imagery of its myths, the rhythm of its rituals, the grandeur of its architecture, all lingered in Israel's collective imagination. In later centuries, Babylon would come to symbolize not just a place, but a condition: arrogance, exile, spiritual distance. The Book of Revelation would revive its name as the emblem of corruption and empire. But beneath that polemic lies a paradox. Babylon, though remembered as the enemy, was also the crucible in which monotheism was forged. The return from exile was not a return to the past, it was a new beginning. The scribes who came home carried more than scrolls. They carried a theology that had learned to survive outside its walls. The community that reassembled around the Second Temple was no longer a kingdom but a people of the book. The priestly class reasserted control, but their authority was now shared with those who interpreted the written law. Scripture had become equal to stone. The echoes of Babylon continued to shape worship and worldview alike. The weekly Sabbath, once tied to the cycles of agriculture, became a sacred rhythm of remembrance, a defiance of the endless labour of empire. The festival of Passover, once a celebration of deliverance from Egypt, now carried the resonance of exile and return. Every act of faith became an act of resistance against forgetting. From Babylon, the Israelites had learned that even in defeat, belief could endure. The empire that seemed eternal fell, as all empires do, but the scroll survived. The rivers dried, the palaces crumbled, but the songs written in captivity still flowed through generations. The idea that began in the wilderness, of a God who travels, who speaks, who remembers, had now become a God who writes history itself. The influence of Babylon was therefore both external and internal. It provided the challenge that forced faith to evolve, and the framework that made that evolution possible. It gave monotheism its permanence by proving that it could exist without territory, without temple, without king. In exile, Yahweh became timeless. In return, he became universal. The people who walked back to Jerusalem after 70 years of captivity were not the same as those who had left. Their journey through foreign lands had stripped them of illusion and given them vision. They returned carrying the fire of the prophets, the scrolls of the scribes, and the memory of a God who had turned defeat into revelation. And though the Babylonians vanished from history, their shadow never truly left. It lingered in language, in symbol, in scripture. The silent teacher of the theology that would shape the rest of human time. For from Babylon's gates emerged not just a people returning home, but an idea returning to its source, that divinity was not bound by place or power, but lived in story, in word, in the quiet endurance of those who remembered. As the sun rose over the rebuilt Jerusalem, and the songs of return filled the air, the exiles stood not as survivors of history, but as its authors. The God they carried out of Babylon was no longer one voice among many. He was the author of all voices, the meaning behind every rise and fall. And through their pens, their prayers, and their persistence, Yahweh's story became history's spine, the tale of a people who lost everything but their faith, and in losing it, found the world. There are few mysteries more enduring than the name of God itself. A name is supposed to reveal, to make known, but this one conceals even as it speaks. It has crossed centuries in whispers, passed through the lips of prophets, scribes, and scholars, reshaped by translation and reverence until it became both known and unknowable. Yahweh, Jehovah, Adonai. The Tetragrammaton, 4 letters that have outlasted empires. It is a name that is also an absence, a sound that can never be fully said. In the earliest days, when faith still lived in movement and wind, the name of the divine was likely spoken freely. Among the desert tribes and early worshippers of Yahweh, calling on the God's name was an invocation of power and protection. It was a relationship, personal, direct, intimate. But as the centuries passed and the understanding of God deepened, something changed. Holiness began to require distance. Reverence grew out of fear, and fear became discipline. By the time the Hebrew scriptures were being compiled into their final form, the divine name was already veiled. In Hebrew, that name appears as 4 letters: Yod, He, Vav, He, Yav. These letters, known as the Tetragrammaton, are not a word in the ordinary sense. They have no vowels, no fixed sound. The ancient scribes who wrote them did not add the marks that would guide pronunciation. The result was deliberate ambiguity, an acknowledgement that the name was beyond articulation. To speak it was to step too close to the divine. Over time, tradition held that only the high priest, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement, could utter the true name within the Holy of Holies. Even then, it was whispered, swallowed almost by the silence that followed. Outside the temple, readers substituted another word, Adonai, meaning Lord. Later, as Hebrew gave way to Aramaic and then to Greek, the substitution continued. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, rendered the Tetragrammaton as Kyrios, also Lord. The Latin Vulgate followed suit with Dominus. By the time the Bible reached medieval Europe, the name itself had all but disappeared from speech. It remained written but unreadable, a silent presence, preserved in ink but withheld from sound. Yet even silence changes with time. In the Middle Ages, scholars seeking to restore the lost pronunciation made an attempt to reconstruct it. They took the consonants YHWH and combined them with the vowels of Adonai, producing the hybrid form Yahweh, which in Latinized English became Jehovah. It was an effort to fill the silence with speech, to reclaim a sound that had been surrendered to reverence. The result, however, was not recovery, but invention. The word Jehovah did not exist in antiquity. It was a linguistic bridge between devotion and misunderstanding. Still, it became deeply rooted in Western tradition, carried by translations, hymns, and theology, until it felt as ancient as the desert itself. Modern scholarship, returning to older linguistic evidence, suggests that the original pronunciation was likely Yahweh, a form consistent with early theophoric names like Yehoshua, Joshua, or Yehonatan, Jonathan, which preserved the divine element. Yet even this is approximation. The true sound is lost, and perhaps intentionally so. The evolution of the name reflects not ignorance but awe. To withhold the pronunciation was to confess that no human language could contain the infinite. The meaning of the name, however, has always been central to understanding the nature of God. When Moses encountered the burning bush and asked for the divine name, the answer was both revelation and riddle. Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I am that I am. From that phrase, scholars derive the root of Yahweh, connected to the Hebrew verb haya, meaning to be or to exist. The name, then, is not a label but a statement of being. God is not defined by a title or domain, as Baal was the god of storms or Marduk of creation. Yahweh is existence itself, the one who causes all things to be. In that sense, the hiddenness of the name mirrors its meaning. To be is not the same as to be named. The divine does not need identification. The divine is identification. Every breath, every act of existence is a syllable of that unspoken word. In the ancient Hebrew mind, names carried essence, power, identity. To know a name was to know the thing itself. To withhold it was to preserve mystery, to remind humanity of the boundary between creature and creator. Over time, the practice of substituting Adonai became universal. Even when reading scripture aloud, Jewish tradition treated the divine name with reverent avoidance. Some scribes, in copying texts, would pause before writing the tetragrammaton, cleanse their pen, or speak a prayer. The name was not erased but honoured through restraint. It was both written and unsaid, a paradox that became the heart of monotheism. The God of Israel could be everywhere precisely because he could not be named like other gods. His power was not in sound but in silence. In later centuries this silence would travel far beyond its origins. Christian translations of the Bible inherited the practice, replacing the name with the Lord. The result was continuity but also distance. Readers of the Bible in English or Latin could speak about God but not to him in the language of his name. The intimacy of Yahweh became the formality of lordship. Yet that distance carried dignity. It preserved the sense that the divine was not to be handled casually, that even in prayer there must be awe. Mystical traditions, both Jewish and Christian, found in the hidden name a source of contemplation. For the Kabbalists, the Tetragrammaton contained the structure of creation itself, its letters representing dimensions of divine emanation. They studied the shape of the characters, the rhythm of their arrangement, as though decoding the architecture of reality. To them the name was not only the identity of God, but the blueprint of being. To meditate on it was to approach the act of creation. In Christian mysticism, too, the ineffable name held deep significance. Medieval theologians saw in the divine silence the ultimate humility of God, the refusal to be limited by human speech. Later, reformers like William Tyndale and translators like those behind the King James Bible faced the decision of whether to restore the name or preserve the tradition of Lord. They chose the latter, ensuring that for most of the modern world, Yahweh would remain an invisible word behind the text. But every translation is also transformation. The persistence of multiple names, Yahweh, Jehovah, Lord, Adonai, reflects the evolving relationship between humanity and the divine. Each carries its own tone. Yahweh is ancient, intimate, elemental, echoing the breath that begins and ends the word. Jehovah feels formal, distant, shaped by centuries of European theology. Lord conveys authority, structure, the language of empire and worship. Together they tell the story of how the unnameable became known through human need. The power of pronunciation lies not in accuracy but in reverence. To say the name, even imperfectly, is to acknowledge mystery. To refrain from saying it is to do the same. The tension between the two has defined centuries of faith. The divine name, written but unspeakable, became a symbol of monotheism's maturity, the recognition that the sacred transcends possession. In a world where gods once had faces and forms, Yahweh's invisibility became his greatest power. The evolution of his name also mirrors the journey of faith itself, from familiarity to reverence, from sound to silence, from the seen to the unseen. In the desert, his followers called his name in need. In Babylon they whispered it in exile. In the temple they feared to speak it at all. Each stage carried a different understanding of what it meant to know the divine. Even now, millennia later, the four letters remain a riddle, inscribed in human consciousness. They stand at the crossroads of language and mystery, reminding those who encounter them that the divine cannot be contained in syllables. Whether spoken as Yahweh, sung as Jehovah, or reverently replaced with Lord, the essence remains unchanged, a being beyond definition, the pulse within existence. The hidden name is not a loss, it is a gift. Its silence invites reflection, its elusiveness inspires wonder. To chase its true sound is to follow a trail into the heart of faith itself, where language ends and meaning begins. And though the letters have faded from temples and tongues, they endure in every breath, every moment of being, the ancient echo of the phrase first heard in fire, I am. Beyond that revelation lies the next step in the journey. The transformation of this name, once whispered among tribes and preserved in scrolls, into an idea that transcended all boundaries. The God of Israel becoming the God of the world, the divine of a nation becoming the soul of humanity. The silence of the name would soon give way to the enduring echo of faith itself, reaching far beyond its origins into every language, every heart that still dares to speak or remain still before the infinite. The story of Yahweh began in storms and sand, beneath skies that seemed alive with unseen power. He was once a presence felt in thunder and wind, a God who spoke through lightning and silence, carried in the memories of nomads and tribes who called on his name for survival. Yet from those early cries beneath the desert sky came something no one could have predicted, a transformation so complete that the God of a small people became the moral and spiritual axis of much of the world. Yahweh began as a god among many, but he became the idea that outlasted them all. His immortality was not carved in stone but written in the human heart. The evolution of Yahweh into the eternal was not a miracle of conquest or empire. It was a slow unfolding, shaped by loss, memory, and the relentless search for meaning. Each age remade him, carrying his essence forward even as his form changed. The storm god of the wilderness became the lawgiver of Sinai, the sovereign of Israel, the voice of conscience through the prophets, the invisible presence that watched over exiles, and finally the silent word inscribed in sacred text. In every transformation, one truth remained: he was never limited to where he began. The god of the ancient sky became the god of the human soul. The key to his endurance lay in adaptability. The gods of Egypt and Babylon were bound to their temples and statues. When those civilizations fell, their gods fell with them. Yahweh, by contrast, learned to dwell in thought. He survived because he was not fixed in form. When his temple was destroyed, he became scripture. When his people were scattered, he became memory. When philosophy questioned the heavens, he became the logic of morality. Yahweh transcended history by refusing to belong entirely to it. By the time the Second Temple stood in Jerusalem, the theology of Yahweh had matured into an idea capable of withstanding exile, empire, and time itself. He was no longer a tribal protector, but the creator of all. The prophets had stripped away the last traces of polytheism, leaving a God who existed outside of nature yet permeated it. His voice could be heard in justice and mercy, not only in thunder and command. He was invisible but intimate, distant but near. The encounter between Hebrew thought and Greek philosophy during the centuries of Hellenistic rule refined this image even further. Greek thinkers sought reason in the cosmos, a rational order behind the stars. The Israelites had already named that order personal and moral. When those two currents met, the divine became both transcendent and rational, the source of being itself. In the merging of theology and philosophy, Yahweh evolved from the God of a people to the principle behind all existence. He became the God of being, the foundation of all thought. The influence of this transformation spread quietly. Through the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, Yahweh entered the intellectual bloodstream of the Mediterranean world. The Septuagint carried his story beyond Jerusalem to Alexandria and Rome, where thinkers began to speak of the divine as one, eternal, self-existent. Even those who did not know his name began to echo his logic. The idea of a single, moral, eternal creator reshaped the framework of civilization. When Christianity emerged from this matrix, it carried Yahweh's legacy in new language. The God who once spoke to Moses from fire now became the Father who sent his word into the world. The message had changed form, but the essence remained. The same unity, the same moral centre, the same unseen presence that guided creation. Through this transformation, the name Yahweh faded behind titles like God and Lord, but his spirit continued to define the sacred. The concept of divinity that began in Canaan spread across continents, taking on new expressions without losing its ancient root. In Islam, too, the resonance continued. Allah was not a new god, but a continuation of the same monotheistic current, refined through different revelation. The Quran speaks of the same moral sovereignty, the same creative word, the same insistence that there is no God but one. The descendants of Abraham carried Yahweh's essence into new languages and cultures, his legacy echoing through Arabic, Greek, Latin and beyond. The name changed, but the idea remained: a God beyond image, beyond idol, beyond time. Yahweh's journey from the deserts of Edom to the minds of philosophers and the prayers of billions was not just theological, it was psychological. Humanity's conception of divinity evolved as its self-awareness deepened. The gods of harvest and storm had answered physical needs. Yahweh addressed something inward, the hunger for purpose, justice, and permanence. He became not only the ruler of the world, but the voice within it, the conscience that whispered even in silence. Through centuries of exile and empire, through the rise and fall of kingdoms, Yahweh's persistence became proof of something larger. That faith, once internalized, cannot be conquered. When the Romans burned Jerusalem, the followers of Yahweh dispersed again, but this time they carried his word into the structures of Western civilization itself. Law, ethics, and literature all bore traces of his shadow. Even in an age that claimed to outgrow him, his influence remained in the questions people could not stop asking, about justice, purpose, and the meaning of existence. Over time, Yahweh's name receded into reverence, and what remained was his essence, pure, abstract, eternal. The philosophers of the Middle Ages called him the unmoved mover, the necessary being. The mystics called him the infinite, the beloved, the light. The theologians called him the creator, the sustainer, the one. Each title was a translation of the same original truth, that the divine cannot be contained by words, yet all words lead back to it. In the modern world, where faith contends with reason, Yahweh's legacy still endures, not as a figure of ancient myth, but as the foundation of thought itself. The very notion that the universe is ordered, rational and moral owes much to the God who once spoke through prophets and poets. Even those who no longer believe in him still speak in his grammar. The ethics of justice, the belief in universal law, the dignity of human life, all trace their lineage to the moral revolution that began with Yahweh. His eternity lies not in his name, but in the ideas he gave birth to. The irony is that Yahweh, who began as a local god, became timeless precisely because his followers learned to question him. Every reinterpretation, by prophets, philosophers, or reformers, kept his meaning alive. His endurance was not the survival of a single image, but the persistence of inquiry. The divine he represented was not static, it was the search itself. In that way, Yahweh transcended religion and entered the realm of the human condition. Even in an age of secularism, his shadow lingers in the moral imagination. The impulse to seek truth, to pursue justice, to see meaning in chaos, all are echoes of the covenant between humanity and the infinite. The fire that once burned on Sinai still glows in every act of conscience, every question that reaches beyond the self. Yahweh became eternal not by commanding belief, but by shaping the language of thought through which belief itself is understood. His story, traced across millennia, is the story of how humanity learned to see the divine not only in the sky, but in the soul. The God who thundered in deserts became the still, small voice of introspection. The lawgiver of Israel became the ethical compass of civilizations. The creator of heaven and earth became the presence that moves quietly in the search for meaning. Perhaps eternity is not a matter of time, but of resonance, of ideas that never stop echoing. Yahweh's name may be hidden, his temples gone, but his essence endures in the fabric of moral and spiritual life. Every whispered prayer, every silent wonder, every act of compassion is a continuation of that ancient dialogue between the human and the divine. From ancient sky to modern soul, the journey of Yahweh is the journey of humanity itself, from fear to faith, from ritual to reflection, from the visible to the invisible. The God of thunder became the God of thought. The God of covenant became the God of conscience. In him, time found meaning, and through him, the human spirit found permanence. As the centuries unfold, the story of Yahweh continues to shape the world quietly, like a rhythm beneath all belief. His eternity is not measured in temples or texts, but in the capacity of humanity to keep seeking him. In the calm between questions, in the spark of reason, in the moral pulse that has outlived every empire. The storm has passed, the prophets are gone, but the echo remains, the whisper that began under the desert sky and still lingers, unbroken, within the human soul. When we reach the quiet end of this long story, when the sands of the desert give way to the silence of the stars, what remains is a name. Not a sound spoken aloud, but a presence that hums beneath language. Yahweh. 4 letters carved into the memory of humanity, both intimate and unreachable. The journey that began with storms over barren lands ends here, in stillness, where the divine and the human meet in thought rather than thunder. To call the divine by name is to recognize not only a God, but the history of our own searching. From the beginning, Yahweh's story was never just about power. It was about relationship. The first wanderers who whispered his name beneath the desert sky did so not to command the divine, but to be seen by it. In that simple invocation was an understanding that faith is a dialogue. Every time a human being called on Yahweh, the world became slightly less indifferent. His name bridged the gap between earth and the infinite, between those who feared the dark and the idea that there was something, or someone, listening beyond it. As the centuries unfolded, that name changed in meaning, even as it remained the same. It was spoken in triumph by kings, and in despair by exiles, recited by priests and whispered by poets, studied by scholars and held in silence by mystics. Each time it meant something slightly different, yet all those meanings pointed toward one truth. To name the divine is to acknowledge presence within absence. It is to believe that behind the silence of existence lies awareness, that being itself listens back. In the old world, names carried weight. They were not mere labels, but identities, essences, destinies. To know the name of something was to know its nature. To speak it was to participate in its reality. When the name of Yahweh was revealed to Moses as I Am, it was not just a revelation of existence. It was the unveiling of meaning itself. The divine was not a thing among things, but the ground from which all being arose. The name was both a word and a question, a sound and a silence. Over time, humanity learned that this name could not truly be spoken. The more sacred it became, the less it belonged to sound. It retreated into reverence, into the hush between breaths, into the pauses of prayer. What began as an invocation became a meditation. The unspoken name of God turned faith inward, teaching that the divine was not only above but within. To honour the name was not to pronounce it, but to live in awareness of its meaning, to recognise that existence itself is holy. The prophets and scribes who shaped Yahweh's image understood that reverence is not distance but attention. To hold the divine in silence was to keep it near. When they refused to say his name, they were not erasing it, They were preserving its mystery. Every Adonai, every Lord, every whisper of the name became an act of humility before what cannot be fully known. Through restraint, they deepened connection. The sacred was no longer a matter of ritual possession but of inner stillness. That stillness carried through the centuries, even when the name changed, when Yahweh became Jehovah, when Jehovah became simply God. The essence remained. Across languages and traditions, across exile and empire, people continued to speak toward the same mystery. They prayed in different tongues but directed their longing toward the same unseen presence. The name was never lost, it multiplied. In every word for God, in every metaphor, every song and silence, the echo of those 4 ancient letters persisted. To call the divine by name is also to acknowledge history itself, the entire sweep of human experience that has tried to make sense of the unseen. The name Yahweh is written in the dust of temples long gone, in the psalms sung beside rivers of exile, in the manuscripts copied by trembling hands, in the breath of prayers uttered across millennia. To invoke it is to join that unbroken line of searching minds and believing hearts. It is to inherit the effort of generations who refused to let meaning vanish even when hope seemed impossible. And yet, to speak the divine name today carries a new kind of challenge. We live in an age where names are everywhere, spoken, written, multiplied endlessly, and meaning risks being drowned by sound. The sacred feels far not because it has vanished, but because noise has grown louder than silence. To remember Yahweh's name in such a world is to remember what silence means. Attention, reverence, humility. It is to rediscover that the act of naming can still be an act of wonder, that words can still open doors rather than close them. For those who no longer believe, Yahweh's name still lingers, not as dogma, but as heritage. The very questions that define modern thought about existence, purpose, morality are descendants of his story. The conviction that life has order, that justice matters, that compassion carries weight, all arise from that ancient dialogue between humanity and the infinite. Yahweh's eternity lies not in doctrine, but in the framework of consciousness he helped shape. Even when unspoken, his name continues to inform the language with which we seek meaning. Perhaps that is what it means to call the divine by name, not to speak it, but to recognize it everywhere. In the pulse of compassion, in the search for truth, in the stillness that follows awe, Yahweh's name is not a word but a way of seeing, a reminder that existence itself is sacred, that being aware of life is to stand in the presence of something larger than ourselves. When we trace the journey from the Anunnaki of Sumer to the covenant on Sinai, from the exile in Babylon to the scriptures that endure, we are following the arc of that awareness expanding. Each stage of Yahweh's story is a reflection of humanity's own awakening, the move from fear to understanding, from many gods to one truth, from the outer sky to the inner soul. The divine did not change, humanity's capacity to perceive it did, and so the name remains, written but unspoken, familiar but infinite. It belongs to every breath drawn in wonder and every moment that refuses to reduce the world to chance. When a person whispers a prayer, questions the meaning of justice, or stands speechless beneath a night sky, the name is there, silent, patient, enduring. In the end, the story of Yahweh is not just the history of a god. It is the history of the human attempt to name the unnameable, to give voice to the mystery that surrounds life. From mountain fires to modern reflection, the same impulse carries on, to speak, to listen, to reach toward the infinite and call it by name. And when words finally fail, when the noise of history fades and the breath grows quiet, what remains is not sound but presence, the same presence the nomads felt beneath the ancient sky, the same that filled the prophet's visions and the scribe's ink. It is the name that cannot be said yet is spoken in every act of being, the whisper beneath creation, the silence behind thought, the eternal heartbeat of meaning itself.